we can open up the shared document again. And this might be the last topic for this PTG in the openstack-tc room. We do have a few more parking lot items that we can take to a weekly meeting. But for now, it's actually going to be a simple one, right? We're talking about licensing and about testing and shipping non-OSI compatible software with OpenStack binary artifacts. There's a little bit of context here, and this was most recently with the aspect of somebody from the Cola team wanting to see if there were any issues in integrating console inside for use with Masakari. And I think we had a few questions about it, about what exactly is Scala going to ship about console. And I think in further emails they clarified that it is integration code, code that is going to configure console, help install console, but they're not going to be shipping console itself. So I'd like to be corrected here if that's not the case. If anybody here is from the Cola team. Uh, but in general, I think this kicked off another set of discussions that we don't really have guidance around some of the usage of software that have different licenses that are not OSI compatible. We do have a resolution about publishing binary artifacts and what the guideline is around that. And we are expecting that all of our official projects are released under the Apache license. But if there is any other software that's going to be part of those binary artifacts, we are not claiming that software is Apache licensed. We are going to have to publish the license of that particular software as well as part of that. I'll pause here ahead, and I think folks have been involved in this discussion longer than I have. So is there any opinions that you want to start with? Clark, go ahead.
So to be clear, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not representing any views of the foundation. This is just kind of my own perspective on it. I think there's a number of like different layers here where where it's like you want to be flexible to support these things, but at the same time they shouldn't be the only implementation. And I guess historically, like kind of what OpenStack has said is, we focus on open source tools. If there's proprietary third parties, non-open source third parties, they're welcome to like have a driver. They're welcome to work in that. But in general, we haven't provided direct support of those things. And I think that still applies here, right? So if Masakari or whatever is going to use console, there should be a non-console open source alternative that is the default, that is what we test, that is what we document and all of that. And then it's okay to have the non-open source proprietary whatever thing on in addition to or on top of that.
A good example of that is Hyper-V and VMware, right? We have open source drivers that can be used instead. We said we can have the Nova driver for VMware and the Nova driver for Hyper-V, provided they're conformant to the normal driver interface.
Yeah, and I think then there's the license compatibility distribution question that goes on top of that. But if our software can run with open source tools and doesn't require on any proprietary things, I think we largely sidestep that problem, right? We don't ship the console stuff with Masakari, or we don't ship Hyper-V with Nova, right? We ship Nova and libvirt, we ship whatever, like, and then it's up to people who really want to use those tools together to build their own packages, their own container images, whatever it is that they need to do to integrate them together. That's kind of how I see it, right? Is the integration is fine. It's just that our focus should be, in the testing and in the building of things is with the open source tools instead.
So
that's my personal stance on it.
So Cola itself actually has a very little used contrib repo, which when I was contributing to Cola, I added the ability to compile OVS DPDK from source again before it was packaged properly. and it was in the contrib repo. And that contrib repo gives you is the ability to layer additional things over the standard images. So if you want to build them yourself, you can inject them in. So like Cola can totally do that if they needed an extra OS Win driver or whatever to make Hyper-V work, then they can layer those additional things on top of the normal Nova Compute image that they have. So there's a couple of other projects that are now on a similar business source license or similar kind of thing. So like we had the same thing happen with Redis recently. I think Mongo before that. In some cases, we can just say, hey, it's Cola, it's using containers. You just use the official Docker container image from, the Docker library for that thing instead. Or some packages have the ability to have externally deployed components. So like Cola and OOO allowed having external Ceph. So you don't have to use Ceph deployed by those tools, but you can still integrate with it. So that seems to be the general pattern we have gone with in the past, is make those things optional, so you can have as Clark said, so you can have the project work without them, but still allow you to integrate them in. So the question here, I guess, would be they're looking for a Masakari console image, I guess, that had a pre-baked in, and I think that could be done through the contrib repo and just have Masakari without a baked in as a default artifact. Contrib full OSI. I'm interested in from the Redis point of view, though. So we all know that like Redis changed the license. We now have Valkey as part of the Linux Foundation or something. That is the still Apache license version, or MIT, whatever its old license was before it changed. At least in a downstream product, we looked at getting rid of all of Redis usage and using the more freely licensed version instead. I don't know if that has been done in other installers upstream, though.
Sean, can you add that question to the Etherpad? I suppose in case folks are seeing this later, they can answer.
Yes, I'm currently just looking for the URL to call a contrib thing, but I'll add both.
Yep. So I think Takashi's question seems relevant.
Yeah, I'm a kind of supportive about the open source first idea, but I think this is a kind of good discussion example we have now. So there is just as a context to share some context. So there is a new Oslo messaging driver which replaces the usage of RabbitMQ by direct HTTP request call. But the initial proposed implementation uses console here. And there is, because no one else is actually, they do, in this case, they do have actual code working in the production, and they are willing to contribute it back to OpenStack. So that is current situation. And if we strictly follow the open source first, strategy, then we should reject them until they provide anything to replace console as an option.
We have precedent for that before. So we've said before that you can't extend Nova to add in a functionality if there isn't an open source implementation of the functionality that you're trying to do. We didn't say you had to maintain that and do it, but we have rejected on that exact basis before.
Okay.
It's been a while because most people are using libvirt in this particular context, but it definitely has come up before.
Do we have any official statement about this? I mean, I understand this, but I think it would be better to have some, the statement, the global statement about this policy.
Yeah, I think the precise statement, if I was to try and formulate this, or the policy we've taken in the past, is you cannot have something in the API that only works in a proprietary implementation of that thing. You can have vendor extensions if it's not an API change, etc., but you can't have it be something that's not implementable.
Yeah.
And it is worth
But,
acknowledging
yeah.
that the part of what complicates this particular situation is that many of these tools were open source until very recently, and so I don't know that that's the case for any of these particular instances, but it's possible that certain things are caught kind of in between here, right? Where it's like we were relying on this, it was open source, everything was fine, and now it's not. What do we do? Um, and so there may also need to be some flexibility to kind of accept that, well, maybe the best thing is to continue to support what is now not open source, but have a plan to transition to an open source alternative instead, or in addition to, I guess.
Okay, yeah. For this specific example, we can, on the other hand, say that we have open source alternatives. I mean, because we cannot use this specific driver with open source software, the full open source software, but we can still use a RabbitMQ driver in also messaging, which can replace the HTTP driver. So there will be some kind of, this might not be really the serious situation, like as I said, but yeah, we definitely may see some confusion. I know that there are already a number of integrations in Oslo, like the Oslo cache tools, which uses Redis, which might have been impacted by the recent changes. But yeah, we need some kind of the policy prepared. That's what, yeah, that's at least my I'm currently having as a priority, urgent priority kind of thing.
Well, here's a concrete example. Mellanox have a proprietary implementation of Open vSwitch. It's a fork that they have that is out of tree. Cola currently has that on the Neutron plugins directory as in the contrib repo section because they don't ship that proprietary version and integration. I think they used to do the same thing with VMware at one point.
Okay.
So at least in the Cola side, I still think that all comes under the contrib thing. They could ship mass carry, but the integration for console would live under there. And then if you wanted to have a Cola container with both of those enabled, you just enable that contrib thing and build the container yourself. Because then we're not distributing it. You're building it and you're taking on the distribution. And at that point, you are on the hook for making sure you're license compliant with that as well.
Yeah, I feel like the testing might be okay, even though we should try the open source first. But testing and shipping are two different things. Testing can be okay for some time, but shipping the non-OSS is the main concern here, right?
Yeah, I guess my point with the earlier statements as far as like testing and stuff goes is that if we're not testing it, we're not going to be shipping it. And so we can kind
I'm
of head off
saying the using non-OSS in testing is different than shipping the non-OSS.
I agree with you because distribution tends to have stronger requirements around it. For example, the BSL license basically says you can use this for whatever non-production use you want, which I would take to understand that testing CI that's completely fine from the license. However, when you start distributing it, that's different. It could be interpreted differently. But what I was trying to say is if we just don't test it in the first place, we're also not going to ship it. And we can avoid the problem entirely. And I guess that's where my stance is on it, is I would just avoid it entirely. But I guess others are trying to find some middle ground where they can maybe, ship certain things or test certain things or whatever. And yeah.
So another concrete example, and unfortunately, all these around Hitachi Corp. What are we doing with Vault now with Castellan? So like we have other backends, but one of the backends that Castellan supported for key storage was using a Vault, and that's also on the BSL license, I think now.
It's a good question. So basically, are we leaving it up to the project teams? So in this case, Castellan, Barbican teams to drop that integration or to make a choice to not.
Well, just from another point of view, we're testing Barbican with the MySQL backend. I think we're not using the Vault one. And I think in our first party CI, we should probably not be. Like those things feel like they should be third party CI or something like that instead. That's a little bit different again from the distribution versus testing with them, because the licenses may allow one, not the other. But yeah.
I guess maybe an important question to ask is what do people get out of us being distributors for non-open source binaries? Are the risks or concerns, or however you want to frame it, outweighed by the benefits to users? Like, because again, I just kind of think like, why would we bother in the first place? We should already have alternatives. We should just distribute that, and if people want to use the proprietary stuff, they're free to. But
just for people's minds at ease as well, the Castellan Bolt stuff, the Castellan team wrote their own very tiny client. So they're not actually using any code from them. They just wrote their own client for interacting with the Vault service. So that's entirely Apache license. There's no issues there. It would only be an issue if we actually package Vault and started disputing that. What they get though is if they already have an ecosystem where they're using that proprietary thing, they can now plug OpenStack into that easier. So Vault is very common in the Kubernetes ecosystem as well. So I think that's what the utility of having those integrations is. The question is, out of our core user base, how much of those are actually going to use those integrations, and what tax does that put on the teams that have to maintain them?
Well, I'm assuming the teams can sidestep that and ask for third-party CI out of this, and have their own policy around, sunsetting something that doesn't have CI integration, right? Nova does this, Cinder does this, and in some part Manila as well, kind of thing. So if it's not tested, we'll add our warnings and bells and whistles inside the software and stop supporting it at some point. But as the teams themselves, they shouldn't strive to test anything like that in the gate. We wouldn't even have a way to do it.
Well, but beyond that, even is like, I guess the topic is the binary artifacts, and so I guess my question, was what do we get out of shipping these potentially problematic binary artifacts? Like, is it beneficial to the project in some way? And maybe that's because that's what users want, and we're making their lives easier, which makes them more likely to use the software. Like, whatever it is, we should maybe understand what our motivation is to do it in the first place, and use that to kind of weigh whether or not we should be doing it against those risks or concerns.
It's a great question. So, is there anybody here that has that's maintaining a project with just shipping binary artifacts? Perhaps Scholar, OpenStack Helm. Anyone uploading any container images?
Yeah. So OpenStack Helm, there's a couple of projects. There's LOCI, which I think stands for lightweight OCI images, and those build some images. And then there's OpenStack Helm images that builds on that and builds some more images from there and pushes those to Docker Hub, and I don't know where else. Then OpenStack Helm itself builds tarballs of Helm charts. And so those are the artifacts that are produced. But it will package up charts for other things as well.
But the charts themselves don't include the software, right? It's just pointers to the software. Is that correct?
I mean, it's pointers to images, right?
Right.
Container images. But they are publishing container images as well.
Okay.
Through the OpenStack Helm image project and the LOCI project, which are both part of the OpenStack.
Yeah, I think that kind of answers the question, Clark. I guess the binary artifacts that we produce are not really being consumed. They're rather more around the build code that we're shipping is what's being used to build these binary artifacts where they're actually being used or distributed.
Well, if you read the scope of the project documents for most of the core services, they specifically say that binary artifacts are not in the scope of the project.
Yeah.
So the primary output is the tarball and also the PyPy package technically as well. But that's when that's when Nova stops. Those are the two outputs that we ship: is the tarballs that go to tarballs.openstack.org and the PyPy package that goes out. Everything else is in source form.
Well, I guess we're not going to hear the answer to that question in this room. But it does look like there was one suggestion of something that we could act on for this discussion about the aspect that when we're adding functionality to OpenStack services, we expect those to be coming in with reference or open source implementations. While this has been a convention in most teams or probably even a rule, this hasn't been codified across OpenStack. So is that something that we can drive? Are there any objections to doing this?
Cinder might actually have this written down because I believe they require that if you're adding a new API functionality to your vendor specific driver, it has to be implemented in one of the in-tree reference drivers. And I think Neutron has a similar thing. If you're adding an official ML2 extension, I think they require you to put it into either ML2 OVS, OVN, or Linux, but the in-tree ones, in addition to then implementing it for your Adder3 plugin. Nova doesn't have this written down. We just have tribal knowledge saying that you need to be able to show that it works in one of the in-tree integrations.
Yeah, I can put Manila in the same boat as well. So it kind of makes are we still expecting projects to lead this within them as it makes sense, or do you expect something like the openstack-tc to have a stance on this?
So I think, well, I was gonna say, so for our software dependencies themselves, not network dependencies, I think that is codified, right? Everything has to be Apache 2 compatible, and so anyway, I can defer to Sylvan. I just wanted to point out that we do codify some of this. We just don't codify it for the network dependencies.
Sylvan?
I mean, about dependencies that we pull for the service projects, we know that there are multiple ways of expressing those dependencies, but I don't know whether we need to have this kind of governance rule, because that's already enforced by for example, by the constraints that we have. So, I would be saying that I don't think this is necessary unless proven wrong, because correct me if I'm wrong, but the only way to pull a dependency is to get through the requirements, right?
No. So the way we do it in Nova, and it's similar in other projects, is we have use of the extras functionality in setup tools. So if it's strictly not required for the project to build and run, so like we don't include the Windows one anymore. Granted, we've deleted Hyper-V, but same with the VMware integration library. It's listed as an extra because you can deploy Nova without having to have that. So we have the ability to express optional dependencies. And through
Correct.
BinDep, we can even be more specific and say, for these operating systems, these are the additional non-Python dependencies that are
Yes.
required, and have that be optional as well.
Okay, thanks. That's something we recently discussed on the Nova channel as well. But those are extras, right? That's my point. Those are not requirements.
Yeah, so we have the ability to express the difference between this is what we actually need to run versus the optional integrations. And then it's up to packagers at that point to decide, do you make that a soft or weak dependency? Because they have different users that they're aiming for, I guess. And I would put the people who are producing container images as packagers. It's just a different format.
Yeah. Okay, maybe the service projects are having different. What I'm saying, like for example, the NVIDIA drivers, right? Nothing in Nova says that, even in extras, that the NVIDIA drivers are like proposed, because those are proprietary, right? There are also other
requirements on it.
Sorry, what you said?
There's no requirement on the NVIDIA drivers. And we specifically don't actually have any code for NVIDIA. We have code for MDevs, which is a kernel interface that any vendor can implement. It just so happens that the only one that's on the market is NVIDIA. But if AMD turns around tomorrow and gives you an MDev capable GPU, it should just work. Right?
Correct.
So that isn't a strict runtime dependency. And that's kind of what Clark was mentioning about compilation or link time dependencies versus things we interact with over a network, over a file system. They're two different classes of things. But in the terms of binary artifacts, we definitely don't want to be shipping the NVIDIA drivers as part of a Nova container, right?
Correct. That's what I was saying. Consider for a second that you can pull any NVIDIA driver, because those begin to be like, if public, I wouldn't say open source, but public. I'm not sure we should be adding them even in extras, right? But I mean, extras are extras. They are not requirements. So I will imagine that for I'll say for the Cola containers, by default, then you should be shipping them, right? Because those are extras. You're not. I mean, that means that those are optional. They are not only like additional dependencies. They are also optional dependencies. That's where it's important.
Awesome. So with that thought, I think we should wrap up. So thank you all for attending. This is the end of the OpenStack PTG. So hope to see you at the weekly meeting, and before that, we'll try to see if we can get the summary out and all the recordings posted as well. So thank you all for sharing your thoughts today.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you.